Well, good evening and welcome back to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with you all this evening. I guess you've noticed about the big ongoing, quote, debate going on with the debt ceiling. This thing's really getting amusing. The Republicans are saying, boy, we're going to stand fast, no new taxes, we've heard that. And now what's interesting is now there are rumors that President Obama might start making some slight reductions in Medicare and Social Security benefits. And this has gotten the liberals all uptight and upset. And they're saying, well, they're never going to compromise their beloved crown jewel of the socialistic welfare state. So things are kind of developing kind of in an amusing fashion here. I still hold with my prediction, though. The Republicans are going to cave. They're not going to stand fast. Whatever Obama comes up with, the Democrats are going to cave too. They've got to strike a deal here. Why? Why do I say that? Why am I so certain that these people are going to cave? Well, because they are totally committed to the preservation and the continuation of the welfare warfare state. I mean, this is what defines a conservative. This is what defines a liberal. They believe in these programs. They believe in Social Security. I mean, ask any conservative, do you want to preserve Social Security? He will tell you absolutely. He will tell you the same thing on Medicare and Medicaid. The last thing a conservative is going to do is say, what we libertarians say is, repeal these things. Get rid of them. Ditch them. This was Lyndon Johnson's socialistic program par excellence, and he was just following in the legacy of the statist icon Franklin Roosevelt, who was the guy that revolutionized America's economic system into a welfare state, into socialism. But ever since then, I mean, those were Democrats, of course, but the Republicans adopted these programs. They embraced these programs. They were so concerned about not being taken seriously by the mainstream press, the journalists, or they were so afraid of not getting votes, of losing the elections. I mean, you've seen this, right, where the Republicans, conservatives make fun of Libertarian Party members and they say, oh, you guys, you never won office and so forth. Well, duh. The libertarians have stuck by their principles, even if it means not getting into office. That's not what conservatives did. The conservatives said, no, getting into office is too important to us. What matters most is not our principles, but political power and the money that comes with political power. We've got to embrace the welfare state. And they did that. I mean, for a while they fought it in the 1930s, but by the time the 40s came along, man, conservatives had just said, man, we got to embrace this thing, we got to support it, and they became a part of the problem. And now they're committed to it. I mean, this is why they're going to cave, because they don't want anything to jeopardize the welfare warfare state. Now, the warfare state, of course, this is where the Republicans, the conservatives, are totally committed, to the idea of America as an empire, despite the fact that we just celebrated the 4th of July, which was independence against an empire. Now, both conservatives and liberals love the idea of America as an empire, 700 to 1,000 military bases in 130 countries or so, occupying 2 countries, invading countries. I forget how many countries the CIA and the military are killing people in, maybe 5, 6, 7, I don't know. And they love this. They're not about to let it go. So that's why they're going to cave, because they're so nervous that if they don't extend this debt ceiling, that all of a sudden they're going to go into default and people aren't going to lend them money. And if people don't lend them money, how are they going to support their invasions and their occupations and their military-industrial complex and then their welfare state and, their Social Security benefits and their Medicare benefits and the farm subsidies and the foreign aid to dictators and all this junk? They have a vested interest in it, and that's why I think they're both going to cave. I mean, they shouldn't cave. I mean, a debt ceiling is a ceiling. Okay, if you're going to raise the ceiling, then it's not really a ceiling. A ceiling is a maximum, and that ceiling was placed there as sort of a representation of how we Americans are feeling about this massive debt that the government's piling on our backs. I mean, they're charging on a credit card, and that credit card is drawn on your bank account. You owe this money. Now, you may not, put it on your financial statement when you go to the bank and get a loan or whatever, but make no mistake about it, that ultimately this massive debt that's piling up, you are responsible for your share, and the amount is now, I think, $46,000 a person. You got 4 people in your family. Do the numbers: $170,000, $180,000 that you owe. Try adding that to your financial statement and see what your bank debt says when you go in there and start to borrow the money. But each of us is responsible for this, and that debt ceiling is saying no more. The last time it was raised, I don't know when it was, a couple years ago. The idea was when they lifted it that time, because you see they've been lifting this thing, but when they lifted it last time, they said, okay, we'll lift it. And we heard all the same nonsense that we heard today. Oh, we have to do this. Oh, my gosh, if we don't do this, this will be a catastrophe. Oh, crisis at the gazoo. Okay, so they lift it, and they extend it, and they let more debt. But you see, presumably, they're supposed to fix the problem, right? I mean, if you extend the debt ceiling, you lift the debt ceiling, you go, and let's say another 2 years. So you've given them a little bit of leeway here. You've said, okay, we'll let you lift the ceiling one more time, but that's it. Now you got to fix the problem. And of course, fixing the problem means you've got to start abolishing programs, departments, agencies, pull troops out of whatever countries you're occupying, close bases. You got to do whatever is necessary, because that ceiling is coming up in a couple of years. And you can't be coming back and asking for another increase. Well, guess what? I mean, for the last 2 years, have you seen them at all concerned about this ceiling? I mean, these journalists, these liberal statist journalists that are saying, oh, catastrophe, crisis, oh, this thing's got to be lifted. Have you seen one of them, just one of these statists, for the past 2 years saying, hey, we've got a debt ceiling coming up. We need to be slashing spending. We need to be abolishing these programs. Just one. Not one single one of these statists that are crying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, we have to lift the debt ceiling. Not one single one of them for the past 2 years says, hey guys, remember the last time we raised this debt ceiling, that was a little bit of leeway. We've got to now start meeting up with this new deadline that's coming up. Not one single one of them. In fact, it's been the exact opposite. They haven't given a hoot about that new ceiling. What have they called for? Always more spending, more debt. Remember the big stimulus campaign? Stimulus. Remember the scare tactics on the bailout of the Wall Street buddies? When they're the Washington politician cronies on Wall Street, and those big investment houses had made some bad bets, bad investments, and they said, oh my gosh, the economy. Oh, we're looking at the precipice. Well, the only precipice it was looking at was bankruptcy for companies that made the wrong bets. I mean, that's what happens when you make the wrong investment calls or the wrong bets on how the markets are going to go. But no, these were the cronies of the Washington politicians, and there was the press, the mainstream statist press, saying, oh, we've got to be spending, we've got to be stimulating, we've got to be debt on top of debt. And not one single one of them was saying, wait a minute, we've got this ceiling over here. How can you be calling for increased spending, increased debt, when we've got this ceiling coming up? Because they didn't give a hoot. They knew that they would get to this point and mount up all this pressure with massive spending, massive debt, and then say, oh, we don't have a choice. We've got to raise the ceiling again. Oh my gosh, chaos is here. Well, why didn't you do something about it for the past 2 years, status? Why didn't you get ready for this ceiling? Why didn't you slash the spending? Why? Because you knew that this ceiling is just a fraud. It's just a charade. It's to make people feel good, like, oh gosh, they're not going to pile more debt on me because they've got this ceiling. It's been a fraud from the beginning. You know, if they were truthful, if they were honest, they just ditch this ceiling business and just spend and borrow to their heart's content, because that's all they're doing anyway. I mean, this is just one great big fraud. They know they're going to lift that ceiling. They know they're going to. Now watch it. They're going to lift it again. They're going to have, you know, more and more debt piled onto this thing. I don't know what they'll lift it to. Maybe $50,000 a person or whatever. But you think from here to there, they're going to start saying, now this is our last chance. We need to start reining in this stuff. Not a chance. They laugh at this stuff. This is all charades. It's smoke and mirrors. They know that their game is spending and borrowing, and then of course the Federal Reserve comes into this thing by monetizing the debt, paying it off in cheapened dollars. So I mean, that's my prediction. They're going to cave. Now, here's another possibility. This is what some of the liberal statists are calling for now. They're saying, well, there's a provision in the Constitution that says that the government can't question the debt, and so this enables President Obama just to keep going on and ignoring the debt ceiling. Isn't this amazing? I mean, these people make these arguments with straight faces. You know, the fact that there's a law in place that says you can't borrow more than what you've already borrowed doesn't question the debt at all. It says you can't add to that debt. But you know what they're really doing, what they're really calling for the president to do is just ignore the Constitution. I mean, let's just be blunt about it. That's what they're asking him to do. They're just saying ignore the laws that are passed by Congress. Rule as a dictator. In other words, do here domestically what you do in overseas. I mean, we all know that the president has dictatorial powers in foreign affairs. We don't like to talk about that because this is America. Certainly the public school teachers, you know, in these government-run schools are not going to talk like that. But that's the reality of it. The President of the United States has dictatorial powers in foreign affairs. He can attack any country he wants. He can invade any country he wants. He can assassinate anybody he wants. He can kidnap anybody he wants. Okay, sure. Sometimes countries like Italy will indict the CIA kidnappers and convict them, as the Italian government did. But, I mean, they haven't brought him to justice. Obama's not going to extradite him. But by and large, the president can assassinate, kill, murder, invade. I mean, remember the CIA, participated in the murder of that young American journalist in Argentina during the Pinochet coup. They've never been brought to justice. We don't even know their names. We don't even know what they did to murder this young American journalist. But that's what I'm saying. That the president can order his forces, and they're his forces. I mean, you know, this, make no mistake about it. The Army, you know, purports to take an oath to the Constitution. Nonsense. Their loyalty is to the president. Whatever the president orders, they're going to do. And then, you know, in their minds, that is supporting and defending the Constitution. Well, so we all know that the president doesn't comply with the constitutional requirement for a declaration of war. We see that in Libya, right? I mean, when was the last time you saw them complying with the constitutional requirement in this respect? It hasn't been done since World War II. Now, why did they do it in World War II? Because they were still complying with the law. But after that, when the warfare state came into existence, they said, who's going to enforce it? The judiciary doesn't enforce it. They know the president wouldn't comply with it anyway. They know the Pentagon wouldn't comply. They know the CIA wouldn't comply with the Supreme Court ruling in this respect. So the Supreme Court says, well, why get involved in this if they're not going to comply with it anyway? Well, this is now what the statists are saying the president should do here. Just ignore the Constitution. Just be blunt. Now, we see it to a certain extent with all these searches of homes, you know, national security letters and secret, you know, monitoring of the citizenry and all this. But I mean, this is just blunt. You know, look for a little technical language and saying, oh, well, you can just keep borrowing and spending to your heart's content, regardless of what the Congress does, even though the Constitution places the power of the purse, the power of the appropriations in the hands of Congress. They're saying just ignore this. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, that's what I'm saying. These people will stop at nothing to preserve their little welfare state and their warfare state. They will stop at nothing. And they keep talking about that there's going to be this catastrophe if there's a default. The only real catastrophe is with the U.S. government, because, we all know what happens when you go bust. Nobody's going to lend you money. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a good thing that the U.S. government can't borrow any more money. But from their perspective, oh my gosh, this is just horrible. I mean, this is like a deadbeat. But that's really what they are. They're deadbeats. They're already defaulting. When they've got the Federal Reserve over there repaying creditors with cheap and debased dollars, that's a default. You're paying off somebody in money that's worth less than when he loaned it to you, and you're doing it on purpose. That's a default. You're not paying back your loan in the full value medium of exchange that you promised to do. So, let's assume there's a default. The government, nobody wants to lend money to a deadbeat, so the government has to live with the tax revenues that are coming in. How else can it pay its bills? Nobody's lending its money anymore. Well, it's got a choice to make at this point, because there's still a lot of tax revenues coming in from, IRS is still out there terrorizing a lot of people, and people are still sending in their income taxes, withholding, and Social Security taxes, and all this. Well, they've got to make a choice. At this point, they don't have the money to cover all their expenditures. And so that means they got to start slashing. They've got to start pulling troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan. That would not be a bad thing. They got means to bring them home and discharge them because they can't pay their salaries, unless they're going to work for free. And I doubt if any of these soldiers want to work for free. It's already enough that they're ridiculous that they're losing their lives and their sanity. The suicide rates are high in these ridiculous, senseless, imperialistic wars and occupations. To work for free, it's just ridiculous. They can continue paying the debt. They say, they default on the debt. They don't have to. They can use the tax revenue to do that and cancel the Social Security benefits and the Medicare benefits. And oh no, Jacob, oh my gosh, there'll be people dying in the streets. The seniors will be dying. Their children hate them. They won't help them out because children are horrible people in life. And oh, Jacob, the doctors will never give free health care to the poor. The doctors are horrible people, and I'm the only good and caring person, and even my fellow liberals are bad people. No, they won't help out. Right? Isn't this the way liberals talk and conservatives too? Well, conservatives will be saying, oh my gosh, the terrorists are coming to get us. If we don't occupy Iraq and Afghanistan and we're busted, our government's deadbeat, bankrupt. Oh, the terrorists are coming to get us, or the illegal aliens, or the drug dealers, or the communists, or maybe the aliens from space. Right? Isn't this the way these people talk? There's always these paranoid, catastrophic, horrible things are going to happen if the welfare state programs are dismantled or the warfare state programs are dismantled. You know what it really shows? And libertarians sometimes are guilty of this, where libertarians call for reform of these government programs instead of abolishing them, dismantling them. Libertarians are really good at calling for the dismantling, like the drug war. But all of a sudden you start talking about Social Security and Medicare, and all of a sudden everything gets muddled, and maybe we ought to give a reform plan or a mandated retirement account. Really what it shows is a lack of faith and freedom. And a lack of understanding of how the free market works. There wouldn't be people dying in the streets if Social Security were abolished tomorrow. Some people might have to go back to work. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I see senior citizens working in stores today. They're interacting with young people. They're not sitting in the corner of their living room in some dark corner, watching television or whatever. They're out there in the vitality of life. And so going to work is not necessarily, a horrible thing. It's a positive thing. It keeps you in the mainstream, interacting with young people and talking with people and so forth. For the truly ill, I mean, those people in cancer wards or stuff, well, of course we rely on voluntary charity for that, but you got to have faith in that. You got to have faith that doctors, will help out people, that this is how the free market works. That, you can see glimpses of it even in this context of the welfare state. You've got, the March of Dimes and the Jerry Lewis Telethon and the Diabetes Association and the Cancer Society and museums and opera houses and stuff where people, you look at the millionaires, they make big voluntary donations. And that's what we've got to restore in this country is there's not this catastrophic, oh my gosh, life's going to be just dying in the street with no Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. These are socialistic programs that are taking our country down. They're taking our country down financially. They're taking our country down morally because they're totally immoral. I mean, they're founded on an immoral principle. And it's so amazing to me that a nation that prides itself on Christian Judeo ethics and so forth, and people go to church every Sunday and they talk about America being an exceptional nation and God blesses America and stuff, and then they support these programs that are totally immoral, that violate God's law. God's laws against stealing. I mean, it's wrong to take what doesn't belong to you. If I go and steal your money and I go give it to the poor or to people that need operations or to help people's parents or their children, or I don't care how sick or destitute or whatever, I'm a thief. And that's a basic moral principle. I'm free to go and ask you to donate to a worthy cause, and you're free to donate your money or not. But that's why Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and the entire welfare state is so anti-moral, anti-religious, because it involves coercion, it involves force of taking a person's money by force through the Internal Revenue Service, giving it to someone else. There's no honor thy mother and thy father involved in that equation. It's the exact opposite. You're dishonoring people when you're engaged in this type of plunder, looting type of society. And no, society wouldn't all of a sudden be dying in the streets. It'd be the exact opposite. If you dismantle all these programs, which is what we libertarians have been saying for decades, right? Dismantle the taxes that fund this thing, the income tax. Leave people free to keep everything they earn. Then all of a sudden, man, you've got some really vibrant prosperity taking place. A lot of people getting a lot of money in a dynamic free market society. And so people have a lot more money to help out others. Your children have a lot more to help out with parents. This is what brings families together. Social Security is the greatest anti-family values program you could ever come up with. And then the same things with respect to the empire. Dismantle the empire. Get rid of it, ditch it, close all the foreign military bases. Yeah, the Pentagon gets upset, but, just dismantle the entire military-industrial complex. Discharge all the soldiers. Cold War's over. It's now time to start thinking about a peaceful, harmonious world in which Americans are taking the lead. That solves all the financial problems. You don't have a big, debt ceiling problem when you don't have these welfare state programs and you don't have the warfare state programs where you have government limited to its proper functions. I mean, to give you a sense, let me explain to you, the basic principles involved here, because the statists are saying, oh, well, we've got to spend more money, Jacob. I mean, golly, we're in a recession. We're in a recession, and we need to spend more money. Well, when they say we, they're talking about the federal government, that the federal government needs to spend more money. Now let me show you an example of this nonsense. I mean, this is absolutely incredible. Now this is from the New York Times. This is from the noted columnist Paul Krugman. You're going to be stunned. I mean, this is absolutely shocking. This is what he says in his op-ed of yesterday. He's criticizing President Obama, see, because a lot of the liberals are starting to do that. Not with respect to Obama's civil liberties violations. I mean, okay, some of them are, but very few. Most of them have zipped their lips and just stayed quiet when Obama's been doing everything that George W. Bush has been doing with respect to civil liberties, Guantanamo, the military tribunals, the kangaroo tribunals, the indefinite incarceration, the ridiculous, Pentagon's, quote, judicial system. He's embraced it all. And the liberals have zipped their lips, just remain quiet about that. But now they're starting to criticize him a little bit because he's like talking about touching Social Security. I'm not talking about abolishing. He's like raise the eligibility age or something. And man, the liberals are going ballistic. Well, now they're attacking him for making this statement. This is what Krugman is attacking. This is what Obama said. Government has to start living within its means, just like families do. We have to cut the spending we can't afford so that we can put the economy on sounder footing and give our businesses the confidence they need to grow and create jobs. Now that sounds pretty libertarian, right? Well, that's Obama saying this. Now, I'm not saying Obama means it. But it's sort of like indicative that he thinks that this can get votes, which is very, very amazing to me. But that's a fairly good statement, right? If a government has to start living within its means, nothing shocking about that, right? Just like families do. We have to cut the spending we can't afford. He's talking about the government, right? So we can put the economy on sounder footing. Who's going to object to that? And give our businesses the confidence they need to grow and create jobs. Well, who complains about that? Paul Krugman. I kid you not. He is attacking him for that statement. These liberals, you got to hand it to them. They do provide us some amusement sometimes. Now, what Krugman is saying is government can't be like a family. You can go and read his op-ed. I'm not making this up. A government can't be like a family. A family can budget, but the government needs to just keep spending and spending and spending without regard to what's going on with its tax revenues. Why? He says, because this is the only way to keep the economy going, that this is a recession, and we've got to stimulate the body politic. Now, remember last week I was talking to you about, that movie Weekend at Bernie's, where Bernie had died, but they wanted to make it look like Bernie was still alive, and so they had him propped up. They would drive along in a car and Bernie be sitting next to him. They didn't want anybody to know that Bernie had died. Well, this gives me, this sort of is like the body politic here in America, you see, because the body politic is like teetering. It's like they've been sucking all this blood, like I said last weekend, and so the body politic's sort of reeling here. And so what Krugman is saying, stimulate the body politic, and it's sort of like that movie Pulp Fiction. Did you see that movie? Well, remember that scene where Uma Thurman, overdoses on some cocaine, and she's like, passed out. And so John Travolta, he's got that great big hypodermic needle, and his buddy tells him, you got to put it into her heart. And so, John Travolta is a little uncomfortable about this, but finally he just jams that hypodermic needle right into her chest, and it goes into her heart, and man, she comes out, poof, pops up. Well, this is effectively what these liberal statists are doing is, man, jam this thing into the heart of the body politic, more stimulus. Well, at some point, all this artificial stimulus, it doesn't do any good. And it's because of all the massive distortions that the previous stimuli have brought into society. Let me explain it in this way. Let's assume that you've got a society in which everybody keeps everything he earns. Now, that's not such a shocking thing. Americans lived with that way of life for more than 100 years. There was no income tax in America from 1787 all the way to 1913, with a couple of exceptions, or one exception, saying during the Civil War when Lincoln needed it to fund his war against the South. But for most of that time, no income tax. Okay, this is what Americans our ancestors celebrated as a free society. Part of it, no income tax. You kept everything you earned. And they felt, well, it belongs to you. You decide what to do with it. And so then this was where voluntary charity came in, and this was where massive accumulations of capital came in. And so you had this dynamic, vibrant society. For the first time, the poor were going from rags to riches, if not in one generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. I mean, the amount of wealth that poor people were experiencing was unbelievable. That's why, countless immigrants were flooding American shores throughout the 1800s. They were penniless. They couldn't speak English. There were no immigration controls to speak of. They were just flooding into America for the chance to become wealthy. To escape all the lands of statism in Europe, lands which, of course, the United States has copied in the 20th century, in the 21st century. But at that time, there was no income tax. Now, imagine that was the case today. And think about that. Everybody then, you have to decide how much to, how to divide your income. How much should you save of that income? How much should you invest? How much should you spend? Hoard, whatever. You make your own allocation, but all that allocation reflects your values, reflects what's important to you. What may be important to you is just present consumption. You may say, well, I'm not going to live very long. I don't think I'm going to live a long time. All my ancestors died short lifespan, so I'm going to go out and just really spend money, and I'm going to enjoy life and roll the dice. If I live a long time, I may be in trouble. People may have to help me out on a voluntary basis. But you make those choices. And everybody does that. Everybody makes his own choice on allocating, but they're reflecting his values. When they go to the mall and they're going to buy clothing, it reflects what they want to do with their money. Now, let's say one day the government comes along and says, we want to hire a bunch of soldiers, and we want to buy them uniforms. Will you guys donate for these uniforms? And families say, no, we don't want to donate for uniforms. There's no need to have any soldiers. Nobody's attacking America. If they do, we're ready to go join up. We're ready to defend this country. But no, we're not. We don't want to donate for those uniforms or for those salaries. And so they keep, spending their money in the way that they allocate, reflecting their values. Okay, so everything's like normal and natural, because now that doesn't mean that there's not businesses going out of business and so forth, because the market's dynamic. Consumers are fickle people. Consumers say, well, I like this iPad today, but tomorrow something comes along better, and all of a sudden, iPad goes out the window. So in a dynamic market, there are people going out of business, new businesses coming into play, but it's all reflecting on what people are doing in their roles as consumers, investors, savers, and so forth. Well, then one day the government comes along and says, well, we're going to impose a 10% tax on everyone. And so now everything changes. You see, now everybody only keeps 90% of what they earn. The other 10% goes to the government. Now, guess what? The government uses that 10%. Now, that's a lot of money, because 10% from everybody really adds up. And so they spend the money on, guess what, the hire of the soldiers. So they suck workers out of the private sector that were furnishing things in response to the needs and wants of consumers. They just offer them a higher salary with all this 10% that's coming in from everybody. So they lure people into this now government sector that doesn't reflect what people want to do with their money. It's a coercive redistribution, and they go out and buy a bunch of uniforms. And now everybody's got to reallocate. Now they got 90%. They got to decide, well, what do we do with that lost 10%? Do we just knock out, like going to the movies all year, or do we spread it out over our other things? Everybody's got to reallocate in accordance with their values. Well, the government all of a sudden is saying, well, we need uniforms, and we got money. Here's our money. We can pay. And so now you got resources that start to get diverted into the production of uniforms. Before, a clothing manufacturer might say, well, gosh, we're selling all these suits and dresses, but all of a sudden they see their income drop. Why? Because people have less money to spend, so they decided to cut back on their suits and dresses. So the clothing manufacturers say, oh, we'll make the uniforms, and all of a sudden, so you got sectors of the economy that start orienting toward this new artificial, coercive, mandated type of a system. Well, okay, so that goes on a couple of years, and all of a sudden the government needs get larger and larger, and they start taxing people 20%, 30%, 40%. To the rich, they go to 90%, and they put a surtax on, and all of a sudden all this money is coming out of the private sector and going into the government sector. Well, but there's always this tendency for the private sector, that people want to keep their own money. They want to be expressing their values. Well, the government starts borrowing money because people are getting upset that the government's taxing them so much. They don't want to upset people. People might not vote them into power, so they start borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. This is I'm telling you the story of Greece right now. I mean, it's also the story of America. But they just go out and borrow money, like they went to the Chinese communists. They wanted to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. They said, let's not tax Americans to pay for that. Let's just go borrow the money from the Chinese communists. The same communist regime that helped kill Americans in the Vietnam War. That's who they went. That's why they're the premier, if not one of the top premier lenders of the U.S. government today. They're one of the creditors, the big creditors, because they just said, let's just borrow the money and invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq, do some regime change operations. So you got this whole distortion. Now, libertarians say, well, what's the solution to all this? The solution is to abolish all these government programs, the uniforms that dismantle the soldiers, put them back in the private sector here, restore people's ability to do whatever they want with 100% of their money, get rid of the IRS, get rid of the income tax. Our ancestors were right that this is not freedom. Well, at that point, guess what? I mean, all of a sudden there's a recession, because all of a sudden you have to lay off people. And so the state is saying, oh, we can't do that. We're stuck, and it's the same principle with people on the dole. You've got all this whole sector of society on the dole, the Social Security recipients, the Medicare recipients, the farm recipients, the dictators that are on foreign aid. Everybody wants their dole. And so when you start talking about cutting this thing back, they say, oh, recession. And, sometimes the market starts to cut it back, starts to, generate a truth as to what's going on. That's where the speculators come in. They start letting people know that, hey, they're borrowing out the gazoo. They're doing it secretly, but we've figured it out. And the markets start reflecting this, and the Federal Reserve starts debasing the currency. People start figuring that out. And all of a sudden, the private sector says, well, we're not going to be producing that much. There's too much uncertainty. There's chaos in the markets. We don't know what's going to happen. And we libertarians say, well, ditch the socialistic system, ditch the welfare state, the warfare state. The statists say, oh, no, that if we dismantle this thing, oh my gosh, all these people will be out of work. Well, hey, they get reoriented into the new dynamic private sector, the dress companies, the suit companies, all the other stuff that's now going to start generating all these opportunities for people that are keeping everything they earn. That's not what's going on here. What the statists are saying is maintain the welfare state, maintain the warfare state, and maintain this iron grip on the income and savings of the American people. And, how long can this go on? Well, Greece has already told you there's an end to this. And that's what lifting the ceiling is going to do. It's going to, let them borrow out the gazoo more and more and more. And all we're doing is delaying the inevitable. I mean, at the end of this road, there's going to be so much debt that people are going to say, we ain't going to lend you any more money. And at that point, libertarians, we're going to still say the same thing, dismantle these things, but it's going to be much worse. The longer you go with these welfare, warfare state programs, I mean, remember when they first started the income tax, they promised it would only be on the rich and only like 2 or 3% at most. Look at your income tax return. I mean, I assume you're middle class. What happened to that little promise? And then let me tell you something else. As things get worse and worse, there's always a chance. I just wrote on this in my blog Friday that there's a chance that they're going to seize IRAs and 401ks, because the more they borrow, and this is the downside to lifting this debt ceiling, that lets them borrow more. And at that point, at some point the Chinese communists may say, we're not rolling over our debt. No, we want our money, you pay us off. And the rest of the world may say, no more treasury bills. You're going to default. We don't want to lend you any more money. The government's going to get vicious. And my concern is that they're going to start looking around for ready sources of tax revenue. Now, okay, tax the rich, yeah. But at some point, they know that taxing the rich craters the economy, because the rich, in large part, they support not only the economy but the government too, with the tax revenues. Well, what's a juicy source of revenues for the government? IRAs and 401ks. They just go and seize them and fund their welfare state activities, or pay their debts or whatever. That's just they won't do it for nothing. No, they'll pay it. They'll pay everybody with government bonds. Okay, they'll say they're good as gold. And gold would be a good precedent here to cite, because don't forget that Franklin Roosevelt did that with gold. He saw everybody had this massive holding of gold, which had been the official money of the United States for more than 100 years. He just said, let's go grab it. Put it in the government coffers, make the government rich, and just steal it from the people. And he nationalized gold the same way that Argentina nationalized private retirement accounts, which is what I'm suggesting could happen here. Now you can say, oh, Jacob, the Fifth Amendment prohibits the taking of property without due process of law. When was the last time that they were concerned about the Constitution? Remember, I just told you they're trying to figure out a way to get around the debt ceiling. They don't worry about the Constitution when they're bombing Libya. The Fourth Amendment, they're out there using these secret national security letters to look at people's homes and belongings. You don't even know when they come into your house. They do it all secretly. I wouldn't be surprised if there were CIA agents accompanying the FBI agents when they do these things. It's the kind of system we're living in. Why are they going to be concerned about nationalizing people's IRAs and retirement accounts? What I'm trying to tell you is that this is what we need to be concerned about, is the massive debt, not this debt ceiling. That they're catastrophic if they if we don't raise the debt ceiling. Nonsense. Keep the debt ceiling in place. Don't let them borrow any more money. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to cave. But remember, we've got to maintain our allegiance to the principles, we libertarians. As these people take this country down the road to destruction, to moral debauchery, both conservatives and liberals, we libertarians have to be there with our principles, with speaking the truth. We cannot do what these people have done. They've caved. They've abandoned their principles, both liberals and conservatives. Liberals claim to love the poor, and look at what they've done with their war on immigrants. Building this Berlin Wall type thing, and look at what they've done with their silence and Obama's disgraceful embrace of George Bush's policies on civil liberties and the war on terrorism and so forth. These people are taking our country down the road to destruction, to moral debauchery. We can't do that as libertarians. Let me say a little bit about foreign policy here, about Afghanistan. The president, is making a big deal of, pulling troops out of Afghanistan, 30,000 troops. This is like their cuts. Let me tell you, part of this debt ceiling thing that they're talking about cutting spending. That is such a crock. What they're talking about is cutting what they plan to spend. In other words, if they're spending, $1,000, when they say we're cutting spending as part of this debt ceiling deal, they're not talking about, cutting spending to $900 or $800. No, they're talking about cutting spending to $1,100. Yes, they're cutting spending from $1,000 to $1,100 because what they say is that, we had planned to spend $1,500, so we cut the $1,500 back to $1,100, and therefore, when we go from $1,000 to $1,100, we're cutting spending. Well, this is ridiculous. I mean, obviously. And the other thing is that they always want to cut the spending 50 years in advance. Okay, maybe it's not 50 years, but it's like 10 years in advance. It's the same thing. I mean, how much courage is that? We're going to cut spending for the politicians that are running for office 10 years from now. Boy, are we courageous. Boy, are we brave. You see, their spending cuts are always in advance, when they might be out of office, where they can come back and be claimed as heroes, and the mainstream press in their community says, oh, our congressman's such a hero. He came up with a debt ceiling thing where he's going to cut spending 10 years from now. In the meantime, they keep spending and borrowing and spending and borrowing. And, oh, guess what happens 10 years from now, assuming that, the country's still around? They just do the same thing. They just pass the buck down to another 10 years. Well, obviously, this thing can't go on forever. I mean, this is what the Greeks were trying. And people like Krugman would say, well, America's different because we got a Federal Reserve, that they got a strong central bank in Europe, the European Union, that won't let them print the money. That's because the Germans have had their experience with inflation and hyperinflation. And, that was why the mark was always so solid, the German mark. But here, I mean, you've got a dollar that's worth what, 5% of what it was worth. 1913 when the Federal Reserve was established. This is the moral debauchery where it integrates with their monetary policies. But in any event, so here's Obama, same principle on Afghanistan. I'm cutting back the troops. Well, guess how many troops are going to be there after he cuts back this 30,000? Double the amount of troops that were there when he arrived into office. I swear I'm telling you the truth on this. That he zooms up the number, cuts it back slightly, and says, see, I'm cutting back the troops, just like I'm cutting back federal spending. Well, this is ridiculous, and you can tell they're getting exasperated. I mean, they've been killing people in Afghanistan to their heart's content for 10 years now. I mean, it's just phenomenal. They have killed everybody they wanted to kill. And they still are killing more people. They're going on these nighttime raids. I was just reading in the paper this morning. They're going on these nighttime raids where they're just barging into people's houses and shooting them up. And they say, well, there's a certain percentage of innocent people. The other people are insurgents. Well, insurgents is now a person that wants to rid his country of an occupier. I mean, they call them bad guys. Why is it considered a bad guy when he wants to get rid of his country, of a foreign occupier? I mean, if the Chinese military were occupying the United States and they were walking around their pompous little uniforms and stuff, and they were shooting Americans and killing Americans and periodically sexually abusing Americans or raping them and incarcerating them and torturing them, and there was an insurgency of Americans, would we really be considered bad guys? Would the statists consider us bad guys for not cooperating with the occupier? Well, I really wouldn't care what the statists would say, because I'd be part of that insurgency. Well, that's who they're killing now. I mean, it's just this imperialistic. We've got to keep this Karzai guy into power, and I mean, he's just a puppet, an imperialistic puppet. This is what foreign policy has been based on for decades. Did you see where they're talking about impeaching him? Imagine that. The Afghan parliament is talking about impeaching Karzai for corruption. I mean, if this isn't the most corrupt government, I mean, with all these trillions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money, which are bankrupting our country, which is now, debt ceiling, etc., they're over there lining their pockets like crazy. They're laughing all the way to the bank. And this is how foreign aid works. This is how rebuilding a nation or nation building works and so forth. They're talking about impeaching this guy. Well, you know what's funny about this? The guy isn't even elected. I mean, they're talking about impeaching a guy that hasn't even been elected. Now, the U.S. officials would say, oh, Jacob, you're wrong. There were national elections. Let me tell you something. When you stuff the ballot box, and everybody knows you stuffed the ballot box with some million ballots or whatever it was, that's not an election. You cannot, under any circumstances, consider a fraudulent election an election. It is a nullity. I mean, let's say we had an election here in, Loudoun County where I live, and there were, let's say, 1,000 voters, and I stuffed 1,000,000 votes into the ballot box, and I'm elected. Does that make me elected? Of course not. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's not an election at all. It's a nullity. It's a fraud. This man is there by virtue of appointment by the U.S. government, and he's heading the most, if not one of the most corrupt regimes in history. I mean, they're making out like bandits, and even to the point where his own government's thinking about impeaching him. And so this is what all these nighttime raids are. This is what this killing is all about, to support this corrupt man and all his cronies. And I think that the reason you've got this sense of desperation, these nighttime raids killing more and more people after 10 years, is they're getting frustrated. I mean, they realize that Americans are sick and tired of this after 10 years. I mean, this is longer than Vietnam. And then maybe they're getting tired not just of American troops that are dying and committing suicide and the alcoholism and the violence. Maybe they're getting tired of all the death and destruction over there too, because there's a lot of people that are getting killed over there, brides and wedding parties and children. And I mean, how long does this have to go on? Well, I think they're getting brutal because I think they understand that that's the only way an occupation can succeed. That's what they did in the Spanish-American War, when they had promised the Philippines independence from the Spanish Empire, and after it was over, the U.S. government said, no, sorry, we lied. You're now under our control. And so they revolted, and the U.S. government put them down. The troops loyally followed orders. That's where waterboarding was used. That's where torture was used. And they put them down, but man, it was brutal. They tortured a lot of people. The U.S. government did. But that's when they learned that an occupation to be successful must be brutal. And so, yeah, they make these periodic apologies. We're sorry we bombed that family. Yeah, we didn't mean it, whatever. But there's just reckless disregard at this point. I mean, they're bombing, they're raiding, they're assassinating, they're drone attacks. I mean, it's en masse now because they're getting desperate. They cannot stand the thought. They know that if they get out of these countries and they leave a disaster, which they're going to do anyway, that people might finally start saying, time to dismantle the empire. Cold War's over. It was over a long time ago. Time to dismantle NATO. Time to get out of these things and discharge these people in the private sector. Time to restore freedom in America, abolish the income tax, and so forth. I think that's what they're really concerned with. So they want to make it a success before they're forced to get out. And so now they're getting brutal. I mean, they're killing a lot of people. Let me talk a little bit here at the end about what the government's doing with this Somali citizen. I mean, this is kind of fascinating. Those of you that keep up with our work at the Future of Freedom Foundation, you know that from the very beginning of this war on terrorism, we have opposed this kangaroo judicial system that the Pentagon set up at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I mean, it was fitting that it was done in Cuba because it really mirrors the system that Fidel Castro has over there in Cuba. I mean, the kangaroo tribunals, the no speedy trial, denial of due process, the use of tortured confessions, tortured evidence to convict people, presumption of guilt. I mean, it's just an absolute disgrace, immoral to the core. When here, our founding fathers had a judicial system that has its faults, but by golly, it's the best around. Presumption of innocence, right to counsel, due process of law, all the things that conservatives just think are stupid technicalities and stuff. Well, this is what the framers bequeathed to us. And the reason they bequeathed these protections was because they knew what tyrannical governments do. And you can see that, in the Middle East, where you've got people that are arrested, incarcerated, kept indefinite. Like in Egypt, where the CIA helped them out, participated with them as they were doing these things to people. In fact, just recently, Noam Chomsky, the noted liberal, he goes over to Cuba, or at least maybe he spoke to Fidel Castro from the United States, but he asked Castro to release some dissident there in Cuba who has been held without a trial, just indefinitely without a trial. And I don't know how that's going to come out, but you see, it tells a powerful message that this is how the Cuban communist system works, that they've got arrests and indefinite detentions, and the dictator can just keep anybody in jail he wants. I mean, this is the ultimate in power. I mean, this beats the welfare state in terms of taxing people and putting people in the dole. This is the power to just go seize a person and put him in jail and torture him and isolate him, drive him crazy and whatever. I mean, it's the ultimate power. And Chomsky, by asking Castro, he's sort of like saying, "Sir, please release him." I mean, this is the rule of a dictator, the rule of men, where you have to be nice and you have to plead with the dictator and kiss their feet and fawn over them and praise them and tell them how great they are. That is compared to the rule of law, where people don't have to be nice to rulers and dictators and bureaucrats. And hey, the law, we answer to the law. Well, that's what's is going on now with what they're starting to do. I mean, we've objected from the very beginning of this dual track of send a guy down the military route or send the guy down the constitutional route, and the difference is night and day. That this is arbitrary power. It's unequal treatment for people. It's an absolute legal abomination. Well, what's interesting now is that Obama's starting to integrate the two. Because they just brought this Somali citizen into the federal court system. They indicted him for terrorism. That's the proper thing. I mean, terrorism is a crime. We all acknowledge that. It's in the U.S. Code. For those that still don't, go take it up with the federal judges, because the federal judges have been trying terrorist cases for decades. You're not going to convince them that it's not a crime. Take my word for it. It is a crime. What they're saying is that we want the option to also treat it as a military offense. That's what makes it bad. And then, of course, when they treat it like that, it becomes a kangaroo system. Well, now they've integrated it. They're treating this Somali guy under military control, interrogating him as an enemy combatant or a privileged, unprivileged, whatever that Obama calls the term, same difference. And then after they treat him under that status, they shunt him over into the federal court system. Now their argument's going to be, whatever we did to this guy over here under military custody is not subject to the Constitution. It's not subject to the Bill of Rights. Now, notice that the Fifth Amendment in the Constitution doesn't make any distinction between the departments of government. It doesn't say the Fifth Amendment applies only to the Social Security Administration, the DEA, but it doesn't apply to the CIA or to the military-industrial complex. It doesn't draw that distinction. It says the government, and the government includes everything. The military, the CIA. I mean, this is what the idea was, to protect us from the government. That's the whole idea of the Constitution. These limits on power. It's the whole idea of the Bill of Rights, to protect us from the government. What the government is saying is, basically that's true, but not when the government the part of the government that's doing it is the military and the CIA. When the military and the CIA are doing it, all bets are off. Constitution doesn't count, Fifth Amendment doesn't count. And that's the argument they're going to make. I mean, this is where we've come in this country. Now they're slowly, instead of having the double track, now they're starting to integrate the two. And make no mistake about it, the next target's the drug war, where they bring in the troops like they did in Mexico, and they use the drug war and the enemy combatant deal and war on drugs, okay? War on drugs, war on terrorism, and they use that as the analogy of saying, oh, we don't have a choice. We've got to use enemy combatant philosophy here too. We now have a choice of sending the drug suspects into the federal court system or into the military system. This is not a good direction that we're heading in. And that's where we libertarians come into play. You know, we've got to continue battling out here in this marketplace of ideas, which is what we're doing. I mean, the good news in all this is that I've never seen more articles in favor of libertarianism and more people that are getting interested in libertarianism and attracted to libertarianism. It's phenomenal. I mean, if you get our email update, you know that we publish a lot of articles on drug legalization now, because people are starting to figure out that libertarians have been right. We've been right about the drug war. We're also right about the welfare state. We're right about the warfare state. And we're really the shining light in this country. I mean, in all this darkness, what's lighting that darkness, the reason it's not totally dark, is the libertarians. We're lighting the darkness. And we can't afford to do what these statists have done, is abandon our principles. We have to stand in there, stick with our principles, and keep telling the truth. So that's the show for tonight. I won't be with you next week. I'm going to be over at Freedom Fest in Vegas, spreading ideas on liberty there and interacting with a lot of the libertarians there. But I'll be with you in 2 weeks. And thanks so much for listening in, whether you're doing it live or by recording. And it's always a pleasure. And you guys have a great, nice rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.